Get out of my car and take that sick child with you." Those were the exact words my husband screamed at me over the howling wind of an Atlanta winter storm. The heavy doors of his luxury SUV slammed shut, leaving me standing on the flooded asphalt, clutching my premature 3-week-old baby to my chest. As his taillights disappeared into the freezing rain, I thought my life was over. But then, a sleek black Porsche Cayenne pulled up inches from the puddles. A man stepped out, looked me dead in the eyes, and said words that would change my entire universe. "Zuri, Washington. I have been looking for you for 10 years. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against a family who tried to destroy you." My name is Zuri, and at 31 years old, I had spent my entire life playing by the rules of a family that never truly wanted me. Growing up, my mother Beatrice was obsessed with projecting an image of absolute perfection. To the outside world, we were a pillar of the community. We attended the First Emmanuel Church every Sunday without fail, dressed in our Sunday best, smiling for the congregation. But behind closed doors, our household was a battleground of impossible expectations and toxic comparisons. My younger sister Chloe was the undisputed golden child. Whatever Chloe wanted, Chloe got. While I worked 2 jobs to pay my way through college, my mother was busy buying Chloe designer bags and funding her lavish lifestyle. I thought I had escaped that toxic environment when I married Terrence. He was charming, ambitious, and knew exactly how to play the role of the perfect husband. For a while, I believed we were building a beautiful life together. I worked tirelessly as a real estate appraiser, saving every penny, while Terrence chased high-profile business deals that always seemed just out of reach. But as the years went by, his true colors began to show. Terrence was obsessed with status. He cared more about maintaining a wealthy image than he cared about actual financial stability. He fit perfectly into my mother's world of superficial excellence. Our marriage hit its breaking point when I gave birth to our son Leo. Leo arrived 3 weeks early and was diagnosed with a severe heart condition that required immediate and expensive surgery. My entire world narrowed down to keeping my baby alive. I had secretly saved $80,000 over the years, stashing it away in a hidden account. It was my safety net, money I earned through endless overtime and careful planning. That money was meant to cover Leo's life-saving surgery. But secrets have a way of coming to light, especially in a family like mine. Earlier this evening, the fragile facade of my life shattered completely. Terrence had discovered the bank statements for my hidden savings account. Instead of feeling relieved that we could pay for our son's medical care, he was furious. He confronted me while we were driving home from the pharmacy, the freezing December rain pounding against the windshield of his luxury SUV. He was not just angry that I had hidden the money, he had other plans for it. While I was sitting in the passenger seat cradling a feverish Leo in my arms, Terrence's phone rang, connected to the car's Bluetooth system. It was my sister Chloe and her husband Darius. Darius ran a tech startup that my mother constantly bragged about to anyone who would listen. They were the ultimate power couple in our social circle, but the truth was far uglier. Darius's business was failing. It was a hollow shell built on debt and false promises. Over the speakers of the car, I heard my sister's panicked voice begging Terrence for help. They needed cash immediately to avoid defaulting on a massive loan and facing public humiliation. They knew about my savings. Terrence had told them, "You need to transfer that $80,000 to Darius right now." Terrence demanded, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. "This is about family, Zuri. We cannot let them lose everything. It will ruin our reputation." I stared at him in absolute disbelief. My baby was burning up with a fever, his tiny chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. The surgery was scheduled for next week. If we did not pay the hospital, Leo would not get the operation he desperately needed. "Are you out of your mind?" I yelled back, holding Leo closer to my chest. "That money is for your son. He needs heart surgery, Terrence. If I give that money to Darius, Leo could die." Terrence sneered at me, his eyes cold and devoid of any paternal affection. "Darius is on the verge of securing a massive contract. He will pay us back in a few months. You are being selfish. You are putting a medical bill over the future of our entire family. If Darius goes under, your mother will never forgive us. We have an image to uphold." I realized then that Terrence did not see Leo as a priority. To him, our sick child was a burden, an inconvenience that was getting in the way of his social climbing. He cared more about bailing out my sister's fraudulent husband to impress my toxic mother than he cared about his own flesh and blood. I refused. I told him absolutely not. I would not sacrifice my son's life for their fake black excellence. I told him he was a coward and a terrible father. That was when Terrence snapped. He slammed his foot on the brakes, the tires skidding on the wet pavement, before the heavy SUV jerked to a violent halt on the side of a deserted, unlit road. The rain was coming down in sheets, transforming the street into a freezing river. "Get out," he ordered, his voice dangerously low. I looked out the window at the blinding storm. We were miles from home and the temperature was dropping rapidly. "Terrence, you cannot be serious. Leo is sick. It is freezing out there." Terrence leaned over, popped the passenger door open, and unbuckled my seatbelt. "Get out of my car and take that sick kid with you. You and this pathetic baby are draining my future. I am done playing a charity worker for a woman who does not know her place. You are socially unfit for my world, Zuri. You always have been." He shoved me. I stumbled out of the vehicle, instinctively curling my body over Leo to shield him from the pouring rain. Before I could even find my footing, Terrence grabbed my suitcase from the back seat and hurled it onto the flooded asphalt. The heavy door slammed shut. The engine roared, and the tires spun, splashing freezing mud across my legs as Terrence sped away. I stood there in the darkness, the icy rain soaking through my coat within seconds. The cold was agonizing, cutting straight to my bones. I looked down at Leo. He was whimpering, his breathing shallow and rapid. His tiny face felt dangerously hot against my freezing skin. Panic seized my throat. I had no car, no shelter, and my phone battery was dead. We were stranded in the middle of a brutal winter storm, and my baby was running out of time. I fell to my knees on the wet pavement, wrapping my coat entirely around Leo, trying to share whatever body heat I had left. The wind howled, drowning out my cries for help. For the first time in my life, I truly believed I was going to die. I believed my son was going to die because the people who were supposed to love us had thrown us away like trash. But then a pair of bright headlights pierced through the heavy rain. A sleek black Porsche Cayenne drove toward us, slowing down as it approached. The luxury vehicle pulled up mere inches from the puddles where I knelt. My heart hammered in my chest. In this weather, on this deserted road, anything could happen. I braced myself, clutching Leo tighter. The driver's side door opened. A tall, impeccably dressed African-American man stepped out holding a large black umbrella. He did not look like someone who had just stumbled upon a stranded woman. He moved with urgent, deliberate purpose. He wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place in a winter storm. He walked straight toward me, holding the umbrella over my head to block the punishing rain. He pulled a worn photograph from his pocket, glancing from the picture to my face. His intense gaze locked onto mine. "Zuri, Washington?" he asked, his voice incredibly calm despite the chaotic weather. I nodded slowly. "I am Julian," he said. "I have been looking for you for 10 years. The wind whipped around us violently. I stared at him, my mind unable to process his words. 10 years I did not know this man. I had never seen him before in my life. Before I could ask what he meant, Julian's sharp gaze dropped from my face to the bundle shivering violently against my chest. The streetlights caught the terrifying pale blue tint spreading across Leo's tiny lips. Julian's calm demeanor vanished instantly. He did not ask for permission. He did not offer empty platitudes or waste time with sympathetic gasps. He simply reached out with his free hand, gripped my elbow with firm, commanding authority, and guided me toward the passenger side of his vehicle. "Get inside now," he ordered. The tone left absolutely no room for debate. He opened the heavy door of the Porsche Cayenne. A wave of glorious, intense heat washed over my frozen face. I practically collapsed into the plush leather seat, pulling Leo securely into my lap. Julian slammed the door shut against the storm blocking out the howling wind and quickly rounded the hood to slide into the driver's seat. The interior of the vehicle smelled of rich leather and subtle expensive cologne. It was a world entirely separate from the brutal reality of the asphalt I had just been thrown onto. Julian threw the vehicle into drive, the engine roaring to life with suppressed power. His movements were precise, efficient, and devoid of any panic. With one hand firmly on the steering wheel, navigating the flooded road with effortless skill, he tapped the glowing screen on his dashboard to make a call. The ringtone echoed through the pristine sound system. Dr. Aris Julian spoke the moment the line connected. His voice was all business, slicing through the quiet cabin. I am bringing in a pediatric emergency. Premature infant roughly 3 weeks old displaying severe cyanosis and acute respiratory distress. I need your top cardiology team waiting at the private emergency bay in exactly 9 minutes. A voice on the other end began to ask a question, but Julian cut them off smoothly. Charge everything to my personal account. Clear the floor. I expect a crash cart and the lead surgeon standing by the moment my tires hit the pavement. Do not make me wait. He ended the call without waiting for confirmation. He already knew his orders would be followed. He pressed the accelerator and the Porsche surged forward, cutting through the torrential rain like a sleek missile. I sat frozen in the passenger seat, trembling uncontrollably from the remnants of the freezing cold and the sheer shock of what was unfolding. I looked down at Leo. The intense heat of the car was helping slightly. His breathing was still shallow, but he was no longer shivering as violently. I kept my hands wrapped tightly around his fragile body, terrified that if I let go, he would slip away from me forever. I pressed my cheek against his damp forehead, praying silently for strength. My brain struggled to catch up with my current reality. Just 20 minutes ago, my husband had thrown me out of his luxury SUV, leaving my son and me to die in a winter storm, so he could go kiss the ring of my mother and sister. Terrence had looked at me with utter disgust, labeling me a burden simply because I refused to hand over my hard-earned savings to fund Darius and Chloe's fraudulent lifestyle. Now I was hurtling toward the most elite private hospital in Atlanta in a car that cost more than my house, driven by a stranger who possessed the power to command entire medical teams with a single phone call. I turned my head to look at the man behind the wheel. Julian's jaw was clenched, his eyes focused intently on the road ahead. The dashboard lights illuminated the sharp, handsome angles of his face. He radiated a kind of wealthy, untouchable authority that I had only ever seen on the covers of business magazines. This was not the fake, rented luxury that Terrence and Darius constantly flaunted on their social media accounts to impress the congregation. This was genuine generational power. The kind of power that did not need to shout to be heard. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask. My voice was hoarse, cracking from the cold, and the screaming match I had just endured with Terrence on the side of the highway. Julian kept his eyes on the slick road, maneuvering the heavy vehicle around a stalled car with expert precision. "I already told you. My name is Julian. That tells me absolutely nothing." I rasped, pulling my wet coat tighter around my baby to protect him from the ambient air conditioning vents. "You pulled up to me in the middle of a blizzard. You knew my full name. You said you have been looking for me for a decade. People do not just search for random women for 10 years. Are you a private investigator? A cop?" Neither. Julian replied smoothly. He glanced over at me for a split second, his dark eyes taking in my drenched clothes and my desperate protective grip on Leo. "I am a lawyer. Specifically, I am the chief executive officer and lead legal counsel for Vance Holdings." The name hit me like a physical blow. Vance Holdings. The words echoed in my mind, rattling against the locked doors of my childhood memories. I knew that name. I had heard it whispered in hushed, venomous tones by my mother Beatrice, whenever she was angry with me. Vance. I breathed out the syllable, tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. Julian nodded slowly, recognizing the shift in my posture. "I see the name rings a bell. It should. I work for the estate of David Vance." My heart slammed against my ribs, a sudden rush of adrenaline temporarily overriding my bone-deep exhaustion. David Vance, my biological father. the man I had spent my entire life trying to forget. Growing up, my mother Beatrice made sure I knew exactly who David Vance was. According to her, he was the ultimate failure. A worthless, deadbeat coward who abandoned us when I was just a toddler because he could not handle the responsibility of raising a child. Beatrice used his name as a weapon against me. Whenever I failed to meet her impossible standards of perfection, whenever I showed a moment of weakness or compassion, she would sneer and say I was acting just like my useless father. She claimed he was a broke gambling addict who left us drowning in debt, forcing her to work her fingers to the bone to provide for me and my sister Chloe. Chloe, of course, had a different father, a man who also vanished, but Beatrice always painted Chloe's father as a tragic hero taken too soon, while mine was simply human trash. "You work for David Vance," I said, my voice trembling with a sudden surge of defensive anger. "You work for a deadbeat, a man who left his family to starve while he ran away from his responsibilities. Why would you spend 10 years looking for the daughter of a man who did not even care enough to send a single birthday card?" Julian gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles strained against the leather. The wipers slashed back and forth across the windshield, clearing the heavy rain, as the glowing sign of Atlanta's premier private hospital finally came into view in the distance. "Is that what she told you?" Julian asked, his tone dangerously quiet. He did not sound angry at me. He sounded furious at the story I had just recited. "That is exactly what happened." I snapped back, my protective instincts flaring hot and fast. I had spent a lifetime building armor against the painful rejection of my father. I did not need a wealthy stranger tearing those old wounds open while my son was fighting for his life. My mother raised me. David Vance was a ghost who left nothing behind but bad memories. Julian hit the turn signal, steering the massive Porsche smoothly toward the exclusive emergency entrance at the rear of the hospital building. I could already see a team of medical professionals in blue scrubs standing under the bright awning, a pediatric crash cart positioned perfectly beside the sliding glass doors. Julian brought the car to a halt, shifting it into park. Before he unlocked the doors to let the medical team rush in, he turned to face me completely. The ambient light from the hospital illuminated the absolute fierce sincerity in his eyes. There was no pity in his gaze. There was only a cold, hard demand for justice. "Zuri, listen to me very carefully," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant register that commanded my full attention. Every syllable he spoke was sharp, measured, and heavy with years of hidden secrets. "David Vance did not abandon you. He was not a deadbeat. He was one of the most brilliant, successful commercial real estate developers in the entire southeastern United States. He built an empire from the ground up, an empire he intended to pass down to his only rightful heir." I stared at him, my breath catching in my throat. My mind violently rejected the information. It contradicted every single thing I had been taught to believe about my own existence. "That is impossible," I whispered, shaking my head. "We lived in a tiny apartment. I worked double shifts at a diner just to buy my college textbooks. My mother struggled every single day." Julian reached over and unlocked the car doors. The medical team immediately surged forward, pulling the passenger door open to assess Leo. But before the chaos of the emergency room could swallow us whole, Julian leaned in close. His words sliced through the noise of the storm and the shouting doctors implanting themselves permanently into my brain. "Your mother lied to you about everything." The doors of the emergency bay burst open. A team of pediatric specialists surrounded us instantly, moving with practiced efficiency as they carefully lifted Leo from my freezing arms. I tried to follow them, my legs trembling violently, but a nurse gently held me back. In any other hospital, I would have been pushed aside and told to wait in a crowded corridor. Throughout my entire life, whenever I needed help, I was used to being the forgotten daughter, forever living in the shadow of my sister, completely ignored by the people who should have cared. Whenever I sought medical attention, I was treated as an afterthought, left to wait for hours in a sterile universe of beeping machines while others were ushered ahead. But tonight was different. Julian stepped forward, his presence commanding absolute authority. He did not ask questions, he gave directives. The chief of pediatric cardiology, a man who usually required months of waiting to secure a consultation, came rushing down the hallway, adjusting his white coat. Mr. Vance, the chief surgeon said, slightly breathless. We have the surgical suite prepped. The infant is being stabilized in the intensive care unit right now. We are running the echocardiogram and preparing for immediate surgical intervention. Julian nodded sharply. Spare no expense, doctor. I want a dedicated nursing team on him round the clock here. I want hourly updates. The hospital administrator, a woman holding a digital tablet, approached us with a hesitant, apologetic smile. Sir, the admission fees and the emergency surgical deposit will be substantial. We need to process the payment first. Julian did not even let her finish her sentence. He reached into his tailored suit jacket, produced a heavy black metal card, and handed it to the administrator without blinking. Charge whatever is required. Put a $1 million retainer on the account immediately to cover all anticipated costs. If the balance drops below $500,000, notify my office and we will replenish it. The administrator's eyes widened. She swiped the card, handed it back respectfully, and scurried away. I stood shivering in my damp clothes, unable to comprehend what I had just witnessed. $1 million spoken of casually. Terrence had thrown me into a freezing storm over $80,000. My husband sentenced our son to death to save face for his fraudulent brother-in-law. This stranger just secured my baby's life without a second thought. Julian turned to me, his expression softening slightly. He is in the best hands in the country, Zuri. They will not let him fail. Let us get you out of those wet clothes and get you something warm to drink. We have a lot to discuss. I followed Julian down the pristine corridors of the elite hospital, bypassing the crowded public waiting areas entirely. He led me into a private, high-security executive suite reserved for major donors. The room was warm, silent, and smelled faintly of lavender. A staff member brought me heated scrubs and a thick blanket. I changed in the adjoining restroom, my hands shaking violently, though my body was finally beginning to thaw. When I emerged, a tray of hot tea and sandwiches rested on the mahogany table. Julian was standing by the window looking out into the stormy Atlanta night. I wrapped the thick blanket tightly around my shoulders and sat down on the plush leather sofa. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the unsaid truths Julian had hinted at in the car. I stared at him, my mind racing back to his incredible declaration. You said my mother lied to me. I began, my voice finally finding its strength. You said David Vance was not a deadbeat. Explain it to me, Julian. If he was this wealthy, brilliant man, why did we live in poverty? Why did my mother work 2 jobs while he supposedly built an empire? Julian turned away from the window and walked over to the table. He set his leather briefcase down, the brass clasps clicking sharply in the quiet room. He opened it and withdrew a thick stack of legal documents bound with heavy red wax seals. He placed them gently on the table in front of me. Because David Vance realized very early on exactly who Beatrice was, Julian explained, taking a seat across from me. He married your mother believing she loved him. But within your first 2 years, he uncovered her obsession with status, her greed, and her willingness to manipulate anyone. He filed for divorce to protect you and his assets. Beatrice fought him relentlessly. She wanted his money, but she did not want to work. I looked down at the documents, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached out, tracing the embossed seal of Vance Holdings. When the divorce was finalized, David gave Beatrice a generous settlement, but cut her off from his business entirely, Julian continued. He spent the next several years turning Vance Holdings into a commercial real estate juggernaut. He owned office buildings, luxury high-rises, and prime retail spaces. But he never forgot about you, Zuri. You were his only biological child. He watched from a distance, barred by a hostile custody arrangement orchestrated by your mother. I shook my head, confusion battling with rising anger. If he had all this money, why didn't he fight harder for me? Why didn't he come get me? He tried, Julian said softly. And then he got sick. Terminal pancreatic cancer. He knew he did not have much time left. 10 years ago, realizing he was going to die, David made a drastic decision. He knew that if he simply left his fortune to you in a standard will, Beatrice would find a way to seize control of it. She would drain your inheritance to fund her lavish ambitions and leave you with nothing. So he hired me. Julian tapped the stack of documents. He placed his entire $150 million commercial real estate empire into an ironclad, blind trust. You are the sole beneficiary, Zuri. The trust was specifically designed to completely bypass your mother. The stipulations were strict. You were to receive full control of Vance Holdings upon your 25th birthday, or upon the birth of your first child, whichever came first. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I am 31 years old. Leo is my first child, but I passed my 25th birthday 6 years ago. If what you are saying is true, I should have inherited this empire years ago. Why am I only hearing about this right now? Why have I spent my entire adult life struggling to pay medical bills and rent while sitting on $150 million? Julian's jaw tightened. A flash of pure cold anger darkened his eyes. Because Beatrice found out about the trust. He pulled another folder from his briefcase, this one stark black. He opened it and slid a series of photocopied pages toward me. I stared at the papers. They were legal waivers documents relinquishing control of secondary trust dividends and authorizing massive financial transfers. At the bottom of each page was my signature. Except it was not my signature. It looked like my handwriting, but the slant of the letters was slightly off, the pressure too heavy. 10 years ago, shortly after your father passed away, Beatrice colluded with a corrupt former lawyer who worked for the estate. Julian explained, his voice hard with disgust. This lawyer had access to the preliminary trust documents before I fully took over as lead counsel. Beatrice paid him off. Together they forged your signature on a series of complex legal waivers. They could not touch the principal $150 million because my firm locked it down tight. But they managed to redirect the secondary trust dividends, the millions of dollars in cash flow generated by the properties every year. I stared at the forged signatures, a sickening realization washing over me. My mother. The woman who dragged me to church every Sunday, who preached about righteousness and sacrifice. She had stolen my legacy. Beatrice used those stolen dividends to completely manufacture the lifestyle she always wanted. Julian continued relentlessly. Think about it, Zuri. How do you think Chloe affords her designer wardrobes? How do you think Darius funded his tech startup? How do you think Terrence managed to buy that luxury SUV he just threw you out of? They did not earn that money. They stole it from you. The air left my lungs. My entire life flashed before my eyes. The nights I spent crying from exhaustion after working a 12-hour shift. The agonizing weeks I spent eating nothing but rice just so I could save $80,000 for Leo's heart surgery. The constant belittling comments from my mother about how I was a failure, how I needed to be more like Chloe, how I needed to support my husband's dreams. It was all a lie. My entire life of poverty and struggle was a manufactured cage deliberately constructed by people who were supposed to protect me. They kept me poor, exhausted, and desperately trying to please them while living like royalty on my stolen inheritance. They have been illegally siphoning millions of dollars for a decade, Julian said, confirming my darkest thoughts. The corrupt lawyer was disbarred and fled the country 2 years ago, which is when I finally discovered the discrepancies in the dividend accounts. I have spent the last 24 months untangling their web of shell companies and offshore accounts, gathering irrefutable proof of their forgery and grand larceny. I needed airtight evidence before I approached you so they could not destroy the documents. Tonight, when my surveillance team reported that your husband had abandoned you on the highway, I knew I could not wait another minute. I sat back against the leather sofa, my hands trembling as I stared at the forged documents. My husband, my sister, my mother. They had sold out my dying son's heartbeat for a luxury car and a fake tech company. They had thrown me to the wolves, completely unaware that I owned the entire forest. I looked up at Julian, the tears drying on my face. The terrified, desperate mother who had begged for her baby's life on the side of the road was gone. In her place, a freezing, calculated rage began to take root. What do we do now? I asked, my voice deadly calm. Julian smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that mirrored the cold fire burning in my chest. We take back your throne, Zuri, and then we destroy them permanently. I stood up gracefully from the sofa, letting the heavy blanket fall from my shoulders onto the floor. The heated medical scrubs I wore felt like battle armor against my skin. I walked over to the large floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the glowing city of Atlanta. The winter storm was still raging violently outside, freezing rain lashing against the thick glass of the executive suite. But inside my mind, I was perfectly, terrifyingly still. My brain was already moving 10 steps ahead, analyzing the massive financial weapons Julian had just laid out before me. 4 days passed. 4 days of sterile hospital monitors, whispered consultations with the top pediatric cardiology team in the state, and the quiet, unwavering presence of Julian and his security detail. Leo underwent his life-saving heart surgery on the second morning. The procedure was a complete success. When the lead surgeon emerged from the operating room to tell me my son's heart was finally beating strong and healthy, the last lingering knot of fear in my chest dissolved. Julian immediately stationed 2 massive, highly trained private security guards outside Leo's intensive care suite. Nobody was getting near my son without my explicit authorization. With Leo resting safely, breathing easily in a recovery wing paid for entirely by my activated trust account, it was time to step out of the hospital and face the people who had put us there. It was Sunday morning. It was time for church. I dressed meticulously. I did not wear the tired, stressed garments of a struggling mother. I wore a tailored black dress, simple but radiating quiet authority. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, unforgiving style. I looked exactly like the corporate executive I was born to be. I drove to First Emmanuel Church in a discreet luxury sedan Julian had arranged for me. First Emmanuel was not just a place of worship, it was the absolute epicenter of my mother's carefully constructed social power. Beatrice reigned supreme here among the velvet-cushioned pews and stained glass windows. She was the head of the Women's Auxiliary, the primary benefactor of the building fund, and the loudest voice in the congregation. It was a fortress built on appearances. I walked through the heavy oak doors just as the service was reaching its peak. The choir was singing, their voices soaring to the vaulted ceiling. I slipped into the back pew, observing the scene with a cold, detached clarity. There in the front row sat my family. Beatrice was dressed in a vibrant purple suit, her hands raised in performative worship. Chloe and Darius sat beside her, looking like a magazine spread of young, wealthy success. And there was Terence. He stood tall, projecting the image of a devout, loving family man to the hundreds of parishioners watching him. He looked entirely unbothered by the fact that he had left his sick infant to freeze on a highway just days prior. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer audacity of their performance. They believed their sins were completely insulated by these holy walls. They believed their social standing made them untouchable. When the service concluded, the congregation began to mill about, exchanging pleasantries and shaking hands. I remained in the back waiting. It did not take long. An usher approached me, looking slightly uncomfortable. He informed me that Pastor Ezekiel requested my presence in his private office immediately. Pastor Ezekiel was not just the spiritual leader of First Emmanuel. He was Terence's father, the architect of Terence's arrogance. I nodded gracefully and followed the usher down the carpeted hallway, away from the chatter of the sanctuary. I pushed open the heavy mahogany door of the pastor's office and stepped inside. The ambush was set perfectly. It was designed to intimidate, to overwhelm, and to force submission. Pastor Ezekiel sat behind his massive desk, his hands steepled under his chin, looking at me with profound disappointment. Terence leaned against the bookshelf. His arms crossed over his chest, projecting an air of annoyed superiority. And Beatrice sat in a leather armchair, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp and calculating. They had formed a unified front, an impenetrable wall of familial and spiritual authority designed to break my spirit. "Close the door," Zuri Pastor Ezekiel commanded. His voice held the same booming resonance he used at the pulpit. I closed the door quietly, the heavy wood shutting out the sounds of the congregation. I did not take a seat. I stood in the center of the room, my posture straight, my expression an unreadable mask. "We need to discuss your recent behavior." Pastor Ezekiel began leaning forward. "Terence has confided in me about the struggles in your marriage. He told me about the secret bank account. He told me about your refusal to support your family in a time of crisis. I looked at Terrence. He smirked, clearly enjoying the protection his father provided. He truly believed he had the moral high ground. Zuri, as a black woman, your fundamental duty is to stand behind your husband. Pastor Ezekiel continued, his tone shifting into a patronizing lecture. You are meant to be his helpmeet, his support, the foundation of his household. Hiding money from the head of your family is not just a breach of trust, it is a profound sin. A house divided against itself cannot stand. You are allowing your selfish pride to destroy the sacred bond of your marriage. He was weaponizing faith to secure funding for a fraudulent tech company. He was twisting scripture to justify his son throwing a dying infant out of a moving vehicle. Terrence needs a wife who builds him up, the pastor droned on. Darius and Chloe are facing a minor financial hurdle. As a family, we pool our resources. We protect our own. Your refusal to hand over that $80,000 is a direct rebellion against the natural order of this family. I let the silence stretch after he finished his sermon. I did not cry. I did not yell. I simply looked at the three of them, observing their desperate, pathetic clinging to a false hierarchy. Are you quite finished? I asked, my voice smooth and chillingly calm. Terrence pushed off the bookshelf, his face flushing with sudden anger at my lack of submission. Do not speak to my father that way. You are in no position to be arrogant. You have been gone for days. You abandoned your home. You abandoned me on a flooded highway, I stated flatly, cutting him off. You told me to get out of your car with our dying son because I would not finance your brother-in-law's failing business. Beatrice stood up from her chair, her eyes blazing. She stepped toward me, attempting to use the physical intimidation that had worked so well when I was a child. Do not you dare play the victim here, Zuri. Beatrice spat out, her voice dripping with venom. Terrence made a difficult decision under immense stress. You provoked him. You are a socially unfit embarrassment to this entire family. You always have been. You lack the grace, the vision, and the loyalty that Chloe possesses. You are nothing but a stubborn, ungrateful child who wants to drag us all down into your miserable little world. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, launching into the ultimate gaslighting routine she had perfected over decades. You will hand over that $80,000 to Darius by tomorrow morning so he can save his business. Beatrice demanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. You will give him the money, you will apologize to Terrence for your disgraceful behavior, and maybe, just maybe, Terrence will be gracious enough to take you back into his home. And if I decline, I asked, my voice remaining perfectly level. Beatrice scoffed, a cruel, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet office. If you do not, I will personally destroy you. I will testify in a court of law that you are mentally unstable. I will tell the judge that you are homeless, erratic, and utterly incapable of providing a safe environment for a child. Terrence will file for emergency custody. We will take Leo away from you so fast your head will spin. You will be left with absolutely nothing. No husband, no child, no family, and no reputation. They all stared at me, waiting for the inevitable collapse. They expected me to drop to my knees, to beg for forgiveness, to write the check right there on the pastor's desk to save my relationship with my son. They truly believed they still held all the cards. They believed their social leverage and their cruel threats were absolute. I looked at my mother, seeing her for exactly what she was, a thief, a manipulator, a woman who forged her own daughter's signature to steal millions of dollars, and who was now threatening to steal my child to cover up her accomplice's bankruptcy. I looked at Terrence, a weak, pathetic man, hiding behind his father's religious title, willing to sacrifice his own son for a seat at a table of fake wealth. The sheer magnitude of their arrogance was almost breathtaking. They had absolutely no idea that the balance of power had shifted permanently. They had no idea that while they were plotting to steal my meager savings, I had legally activated a trust fund worth $150 million. They had no idea that I already knew about the forged documents, the stolen dividends, and the impending federal indictment hanging over Darius and Terrence. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of surrender. It was the smile of an executioner who had just been handed the signed death warrant of her enemies. You are right about one thing, Mother, I said. my voice echoing with a quiet, lethal authority that made Terence take a subconscious step backward. I am no longer fit for this family. I let my gaze drift slowly around the pastor's office, taking in the framed degrees, the expensive theological texts lining the shelves, and the plush leather seating. It was a room designed to make visitors feel small, to make them feel judged and inadequate. For years, I would have shrunk under the weight of this room and the combined glare of these three people. I would have internalized their venom and believed that I was the problem. I would have believed that my desire to protect my son's life was somehow a selfish act that disrupted their holy harmony. But the air in the room felt entirely different now. It felt thin, fragile, and utterly transparent. Pastor Ezekiel frowned, clearly unsettled by my reaction. He was accustomed to tears. He was accustomed to parishioners breaking down under his spiritual authority and seeking his guidance for redemption. My steady, unblinking stare unnerved him. "Zuri," the pastor said, softening his tone in a final attempt to manipulate my emotions. "We are not trying to be cruel. We are trying to guide you back to the righteous path. Terence is willing to forgive your insubordination. He is willing to bring you and Leo back into the fold, provided you show the proper respect and financial cooperation. The Lord commands us to be forgiving, but you must take the first step. Hand over the savings. Let Darius stabilize his company. It is for the greater good of the entire family." The greater good, I repeated softly, tasting the hypocrisy of the phrase. The greater good means letting my son die so Darius can keep leasing sports cars. Terence slammed his hand down on the edge of the desk. "Stop being so dramatic. Leo is fine. He is in the hospital. He is getting care. You are just using him as an excuse to hoard money that belongs to this family." "Leo is fine because I made sure he was fine," I stated, my eyes locking onto Terence's. "Not because of you. You left him in the rain." Beatrice stepped between us, her patience entirely exhausted. "Enough of this back and forth. You have heard the terms, Zuri. We are done negotiating with you. You have 24 hours to transfer that $80,000. If you fail to do so, my lawyers will begin the process of declaring you unfit. I have the resources to bury you in family court. I have the entire congregation willing to testify to Terence's good character and your erratic behavior. You cannot win this fight. You have no money, you have no power, and you have no one in your corner." She leaned in close, her designer perfume clashing with the sterile air of the office. "Do not test me, little girl. You will lose." I held my ground, not flinching, not breaking eye contact. The sheer irony of her threat was staggering. She was threatening me with lawyers, completely unaware that the most powerful legal team in the state of Georgia was currently mobilizing to tear her life apart piece by piece. "I understand the terms perfectly," I replied, my voice steady, devoid of any fear or submission. "You have made your position incredibly clear." "Good," Beatrice said, stepping back and smoothing the front of her purple suit, a triumphant smirk appearing on her lips. "I am glad you have finally decided to be reasonable. I expect the transfer confirmation by tomorrow morning." I did not confirm or deny her demand. I simply looked at the three of them one last time, memorizing the arrogant certainty on their faces. This would be the last time they ever looked at me with superiority. I turned on my heel, grasping the brass handle of the heavy mahogany door. "Remember, Zuri?" Pastor Ezekiel called out behind me, his voice returning to its booming, pulpit-ready cadence. "Pride comes before the fall." I paused at the threshold, opening the door to the empty hallway. I looked back over my shoulder, my cold smile returning. "Yes, Pastor," I agreed softly. "It certainly does." I walked out of the office, the door clicking shut behind me, leaving them to their false victory, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire world was about to be burned to ashes. I had barely made it 3 steps down the carpeted hallway when the heavy mahogany door swung open behind me. The brass hinges groaned in protest against the sudden force. "We are not finished," Terence barked, his voice echoing sharply down the empty corridor. I stopped walking. I did not flinch, nor did I look back over my shoulder immediately. I took a slow, calculated breath, letting the cool, sterile air of the church hallway fill my lungs. I turned around with deliberate slowness, my face an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. Terrence stood in the doorway, his chest puffed out, radiating an unearned sense of authority. Behind him, Pastor Ezekiel and my mother watched with predatory anticipation. They had orchestrated this entire morning down to the final detail, and they were not going to let me leave until they delivered their ultimate killing blow. I walked back into the office, my footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. Terrence marched past me and approached his father's massive desk. He reached into the top drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. He lifted the flap and withdrew a stack of crisply printed legal documents. With a theatrical flourish, he slammed the papers down onto the polished wood surface. The sharp smack echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "You thought you could just walk away from this family without consequences," Terrence sneered, leaning his knuckles against the desk. "You thought you could disrespect my father, insult your mother, and refuse to help your own brother-in-law without facing justice. You are incredibly naive, Zuri. We are not just going to let you dictate the terms of your exit." I looked down at the stack of papers. The bold black letters at the top of the first page read, "Petition for dissolution of marriage and child custody agreement." It was a divorce decree. He had already gone to a lawyer. He had spent the days since he abandoned his dying son on a freezing highway conspiring with my mother to legally ruin me. "Read them," Terrence ordered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Read every single line so you understand exactly what happens when you cross us." I did not need to be told twice. I stepped forward and picked up the heavy stack of documents. My eyes scanned the legal jargon with terrifying speed. Julian, the lead counsel for Vance Holdings, had spent hours educating me on legal terminology during my time at the hospital. My mind was now primed to dissect contracts, and what I saw on these pages was nothing short of financial and maternal slaughter. The terms were beyond humiliating. They were designed to completely eradicate my existence. According to the petition, I was to leave the marriage entirely empty-handed. I was to waive all rights to our shared bank accounts, our vehicles, and the small equity we had built in our starter home. Furthermore, the agreement explicitly stated that I would absorb $40,000 in high-interest credit card debt that Terrence alone had racked up buying designer suits, expensive dinners, and gifts to impress Darius and Chloe's wealthy social circle. He was legally binding me to pay for the very lifestyle that had destroyed our family. But the financial devastation was nothing compared to the final page. I turned to the custody arrangement, my eyes locking onto the stipulations regarding my infant son. Terrence was demanding full physical and legal custody of Leo. The document outlined a narrative where I was deemed mentally unstable, financially destitute, and unfit to provide a safe home for a child with severe medical needs. It stipulated that Beatrice would act as the primary caregiver while Terrence worked effectively, handing my baby over to the woman who had stolen my entire inheritance. I was to be granted supervised visitation only at their strict discretion. "Sign it," Terrence demanded, stepping closer to me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission. "Sign it right now, or we ruin you. If you fight this, my father will hire the most ruthless family law attorney in Atlanta. We will drag your name through the mud. We will bring in character witnesses from the congregation to testify about your erratic behavior." Beatrice leaned forward in her leather armchair, a wicked smile playing on her lips. "You have absolutely nothing, Zuri. You have no money for a lawyer. You have no home to take that baby to. You cannot even afford to pay for his medical treatments without that $80,000 you are so selfishly hoarding. If you drag this into court, the judge will look at your bank accounts and laugh you out of the building. You will lose everything, and you will be buried in legal fees for the rest of your miserable life." Pastor Ezekiel nodded solemnly, playing the role of the righteous patriarch. "It is the only way, Zuri. Submit to this process gracefully, and we will ensure the child is raised in a proper God-fearing home." They waited for the breakdown. They waited for the tears to fall, for my hands to shake, for the desperate pleading of a mother about to lose her child. They wanted to see me shatter into a million pieces on that Persian rug. Instead, a wave of cold, crystalline clarity washed over my entire being. As I stared at the divorce papers, a profound realization bloomed in my mind. Julian had warned me about this exact scenario. He had warned me that because I was legally married to Terrence, any sudden influx of wealth could potentially become entangled in messy marital asset disputes. Georgia law could be complicated regarding inheritances, especially if the spouse claimed they contributed to the marital estate, while the inheritance was being contested. Julian had explicitly told me that securing a clean, uncontested legal separation was the absolute first step we needed to take before Vance Holdings could formally transfer the $150 million into my personal accounts. By trying to destroy me, Terrence had just handed me the master key to my own absolute freedom. By drafting a document that explicitly stated neither party had any claim to the other's future assets or hidden wealth, he was legally signing away his right to discover the Vance Holdings Trust. He was so blindingly greedy, so focused on burying me with $40,000 of his petty credit card debt, that he was permanently locking himself out of a billion-dollar empire. He was trading a kingdom for a few tailored suits and a fake victory. I looked up from the papers. My expression was terrifyingly stoic. I felt absolute ruthless indifference toward the three people standing in front of me. They were no longer my family. They were merely obstacles that had just removed themselves from my path. I reached across the mahogany desk and picked up Pastor Ezekiel's heavy gold-plated fountain pen. I clicked the cap off with a sharp, metallic snap. Terrence blinked, clearly thrown off guard by my complete lack of resistance. "What are you doing?" he asked, a hint of uncertainty finally creeping into his arrogant voice. I did not answer him. I flipped to the first signature line on the financial waiver. I pressed the gold nib to the paper and signed my name with smooth, elegant strokes. I turned the page. I signed the debt assumption clause, legally taking on his $40,000 of toxic debt without a single flinch. I turned to the custody agreement, the document designed to rip my son away from me, and I signed that too. I signed every single page, my hand steady, my heart beating with a slow, powerful rhythm. Beatrice stood up from her chair, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. This was not the script she had written. She had wanted to break me. She had wanted to watch me beg. My silent, immediate compliance was unnerving her. "Zuri, do you even understand what you are signing?" she demanded, her voice losing its triumphant edge. "You are giving up everything." I placed the gold pen back onto the desk, aligning it perfectly parallel to the edge of the wood. I gathered the freshly signed divorce papers, tapped them against the desktop to straighten the edges, and handed the thick stack back to a completely stunned Terrence. I looked at my mother and delivered a chillingly calm line. "You are right, Mother," I said, my voice echoing with a final resonant authority. "I do not belong in this family anymore. Keep the papers. I will be keeping my son." I turned my back and walked out of the church, leaving them utterly confused by my sudden lack of resistance. They stared blankly at the closed door, completely unaware that they had just handed me the legal severance I desperately needed to destroy them all without marital liability. The trap was set. Outside the church, I walked down the stone steps, with a purposeful stride, leaving the oppressive shadow of First Emmanuel Church far behind. Julian waited at the curb in a sleek black town car. He opened the rear door, his eyes scanning my face for emotional distress. He found none. I slid inside the envelope of signed divorce papers resting on my lap. Julian closed the door and got into the driver's seat. "Is it done?" Julian asked, glancing through the rearview mirror as he merged into traffic. I handed over the envelope. Terrence demanded everything. I replied, my voice steady. The house, the car, and his toxic credit card debt. He even demanded full custody of Leo, hoping to force me to beg. I signed every page without hesitation. Julian let out a low chuckle, placing the envelope on the passenger seat. He has absolutely no idea what he just did. By establishing a legally binding separation of assets prior to the trust's activation, your ex-husband just built an impenetrable firewall between his empty accounts and your incoming empire. He willingly surrendered his only legal avenue to contest your inheritance. We will file these papers tomorrow morning. By the time Terrence realizes his mistake, the concrete will be dry. "Take me to the office, Julian," I commanded. "It is time." Julian pressed the accelerator, heading straight for the towering skyscrapers of the financial district. We pulled up to a massive structure of gleaming glass and steel. The silver letters above the main entrance caught the afternoon sun, reading Vance Holdings. My father's legacy. My legacy. Julian led me through the pristine lobby past the polished marble security desk and directly into an exclusive express elevator. He inserted a specialized keycard, pressing the button for the top floor. As we ascended, I caught my reflection in the mirrored doors. I no longer looked like the exhausted, financially ruined mother who had begged for her baby's life on the side of a flooded highway. The tailored black dress I wore clung to me like armor. My spine was straight, my chin held high. The frightened girl who constantly sought her mother's approval was completely dead. In her place stood a sharp, calculating executive ready to claim her throne. The elevator door slid open with a soft chime, revealing a sprawling penthouse boardroom. The space was magnificent, boasting floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city I was about to conquer. Around the massive mahogany table sat the Vance Holdings board of directors. A dozen men and women in impeccably tailored suits stood up immediately as I crossed the threshold. Their eyes were fixed on me, a mixture of profound respect and intense curiosity radiating from their faces. They had been waiting a decade for the rightful heir to arrive. Julian walked to the head of the long table, gesturing toward the empty, high-backed leather chair. He opened his briefcase and laid out a series of heavy documents, each marked with the distinctive red wax seal of the estate. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian announced, his voice carrying absolute authority across the silent boardroom, "I present to you the sole beneficiary of the David Vance estate and the new Chief Executive Officer of Vance Holdings, Ms. Zuri Vance." I did not flinch at the use of my maiden name. I embraced it. I walked to the head of the table and stood behind the heavy leather chair. I looked at the powerful executives gathered before me. There was no hesitation in my movements. I reached out, picked up the gold pen resting beside the documents, and began to sign. I signed the transfer of assets. I signed the corporate ownership declarations. I signed the authorization forms that officially bypassed my mother's fraudulent secondary trusts. With every stroke of the pen, I felt a massive surge of generational power flowing directly into my veins. The final signature activated the blind trust, instantly transferring $150 million in commercial real estate assets and liquid capital into my absolute control. I set the pen down. The satisfying click echoed in the quiet room. I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down at the head of the table, claiming my rightful position as the head of the empire. The board members took their seats in unison, waiting for my first directive. "Thank you for your dedication to my father's legacy." During my absence, I began, my voice projecting a cold, unwavering strength. "However, the era of passive management is officially over. We have immediate business to attend to. Julian, I want a complete microscopic forensic audit executed immediately." Julian opened a fresh notepad. "Where are we looking, Ms. Vance?" "I want you to rip apart the financial records of Darius's tech startup, and I want a full-scale investigation into Terrence's personal and professional finances," I commanded. "Dig into every single shell company, every offshore account, every hidden tax return, and every corporate loan they have filed over the past 5 years. I want to know exactly where my stolen inheritance went, and I want to know exactly how deep their current desperation runs. Leave no stone unturned. If they bought a cup of coffee with stolen money, I want the receipt on this desk by tomorrow morning." Julian nodded, a predatory smile forming on his lips. "My team is already on standby. We will begin the digital extraction immediately." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in corporate warfare. I did not leave the penthouse suite. I ordered meals to the boardroom and slept on a plush sofa in the adjoining office, analyzing the endless streams of financial data Julian's team uncovered. While Leo continued to recover beautifully in the pediatric intensive care unit under the watchful eyes of my private security detail, I systematically dismantled the fake reality my family had constructed. What Julian and his team found was not just evidence of petty theft. It was pure, unadulterated gold. It was the key to their absolute destruction. On Tuesday morning, Julian walked into the boardroom carrying a thick black binder. He looked exhausted but incredibly triumphant. He dropped the binder onto the mahogany table directly in front of me. "You were right to suspect their desperation went deeper than maintaining appearances," Julian said, pulling up a chair. "Darius and Terrence did not just need that $80,000 from your savings to save face at their country club. They needed it to stay out of federal prison." I opened the black binder, my eyes scanning the highlighted bank records, the heavily redacted corporate filings, and the internal company emails Julian's hackers had intercepted. The scope of their criminality was staggering. Darius's tech startup was a complete mirage. He had never developed a working software platform. He had never secured legitimate venture capital. Instead, he and Terrence had created an elaborate Ponzi scheme. They had been using the stolen secondary dividends from my trust to fabricate revenue streams, inflating the company's value to trick local investors into handing over millions of dollars. But the stolen dividends had dried up when Julian locked down the accounts 2 years ago. Without my money funding their fake success, their entire house of cards began to collapse. But the real betrayal, the digital knife that cut the deepest, was hidden in the final section of the binder. Julian leaned forward, pointing to a series of loan applications filed with a major national bank. "Look at the guarantor signatures on those documents." I stared at the pages. They're boldly printed on the dotted lines of multiple high-risk business loans totaling over $2 million was my name, Zuri, Washington. "They did not just steal from your father's estate," Julian explained, his voice cold with disgust. "When the trust dividends stopped flowing, Darius and Terrence realized they needed massive amounts of capital to keep their investors from reporting them to the authorities. Terrence knew you had a pristine credit score. You lived modestly, you paid every bill on time, and you carried zero debt. He used his position as your husband to access your social security number and private financial information. He and Darius forged your signature using your perfect credit history to fraudulently secure massive corporate loans under your name." I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white. The $80,000 Terrence had demanded from my savings account was not an investment. It was what they needed to cover impending minimum payments on fraudulent loans. The black excellence they constantly paraded online was entirely funded by illicit debt stolen maliciously under my name. They needed the money to stay out of federal prison, and I was about to lock them inside it instead. Julian watched profound realization settle into my expression. I slowly closed the thick binder and looked up at him. "We have our ammunition, Julian," I said. "Prepare for the final strike. We will end them tomorrow." Across town, inside a heavily mortgaged McMansion situated in the upscale suburbs of Buckhead, the carefully curated illusion of absolute perfection was violently unraveling. Terrence stood in the center of his brother-in-law's pristine marble kitchen, furiously declining another incoming call from a persistent collection agency. His hands, usually steady and perfectly manicured, were shaking violently. Outside in the circular driveway, his prized luxury SUV, the very same heavy vehicle he had ruthlessly thrown his wife and sick child out of, was parked completely out of sight behind a tall privacy hedge. He had received the official repossession notice 3 days ago, and he was rapidly running out of secure places to hide it from the prying eyes of their wealthy neighbors. Darius paced the length of the massive kitchen island, his expensive silk tie loosened, and his eyes bloodshot from severe sleep deprivation. The confident, arrogant tech CEO persona he broadcasted daily to the world was entirely gone, replaced by the manic, erratic energy of a cornered animal. His open laptop screen displayed a terrifying sea of red numbers and urgent banking alerts. Payroll for his phantom employees was bouncing across multiple accounts. The massive interest payments on the $2 million in fraudulent loans they had maliciously taken out under Zuri's name were due in exactly 4 days. If they defaulted on those payments, the bank's automated fraud department would immediately trigger a federal investigation, exposing their entire financial charade to the world. In the adjacent formal living room, completely oblivious to the impending legal doom hanging over her husband, Chloe was aggressively instructing a team of event florists over the phone, demanding exotic white orchids be flown in immediately. Beside her sat Beatrice, furiously tapping a gold credit card against her chin as she navigated an online checkout cart filled with designer evening wear. "My card was just declined again," Beatrice hissed, glaring at her phone screen in sheer indignation. "Darius, you need to wire a financial transfer to my account immediately. I cannot possibly attend the most important social event of the entire season wearing something from last year. The society reporters will be there. People will talk." Darius stopped pacing and stared at his mother-in-law with absolute unhinged disbelief. "There is no money to transfer, Beatrice. The corporate accounts are completely empty. We are running on fumes and borrowed time. We need liquid cash right now, not custom couture dresses." Terrence slammed his phone face down on the granite counter, the sound echoing sharply. If Zuri had not been so utterly selfish and stubborn, we would have had the $80,000 from her hidden savings to cover the minimum payments and buy us another month. She ruined everything. I served her the divorce papers at the church, expecting her to fight or beg, and she did not even flinch. She just signed them and walked away. We have absolutely no leverage over her anymore." Beatrice scoffed, waving her hand dismissively at his panic. "Forget about Zuri. She was always dead weight dragging us down. She is completely out of the picture, wandering the streets with a sick baby and $40,000 of your credit card debt. She is neutralized. We need to focus all our energy on the gala. The gala is our only salvation." Beatrice was right about one critical thing. The upcoming Vanguard Gala was their absolute final play. Darius and Terrence had foolishly spent the very last of their stolen funds securing the most exclusive luxury ballroom in downtown Atlanta, hiring premium caterers and inviting the wealthiest socialites and business magnates in the city. The entire extravagant event was a meticulously constructed theater production designed to trap a single extremely elusive whale. Darius opened a sleek, leather-bound folder on the kitchen island. Inside was a desperate pitch deck filled with fabricated user metrics, stolen intellectual property designs, and wildly inflated revenue projections. He tapped his index finger against the target name printed in bold black letters on the cover page. "Apex Capital." Darius said, his voice dropping to a desperate, urgent whisper. "They are a massive, highly secretive venture capital firm that recently expanded their portfolio into the Atlanta tech sector. They do not operate like normal investment firms. They have no public faces, no accessible board of directors, just a ruthless network of acquisitions managers who throw around millions of dollars in instant seed funding." Terrence nodded, his eyes locked onto the folder with greedy, unblinking desperation. "I spoke to their corporate liaison yesterday afternoon. He confirmed that a senior executive representative from Apex Capital will be attending the Vanguard Gala in person to evaluate our presentation. If we impress them with our networking, they have the absolute power to write a check on the spot." "We do not just need to impress them," Darius corrected, slamming his fist against the marble countertop. "We need to secure exactly $5 million by Friday. If we secure the Apex funding, we can instantly pay off the fraudulent loans we took out under Zuri's name, cover our digital tracks, and actually build the software platform we have been faking for 2 years. We sell them the ultimate, flawless vision of Black excellence. We use Chloe and Beatrice to charm the representative, we project absolute generational wealth, and we walk away with the cash. If Apex Capital walks away, the bank flags our accounts, the federal investigators move in, and we all go to federal prison for wire fraud and identity theft. We have to nail this pitch." Terrence straightened his posture, adjusting his designer collar with false bravado. "We will nail it. We will put on the show of a lifetime. By tomorrow night, we will be completely untouchable." Back in the silent glass-enclosed penthouse of Vance Holdings, the reality of their pathetic situation was being dissected with surgical precision. The glowing city lights of Atlanta sprawled out beneath the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a cool, calculating glow across the polished mahogany boardroom table. I sat at the head of the table sipping black coffee from a delicate porcelain cup. The intense adrenaline of the past 48 hours had crystallized into a state of absolute hyper-focused calm. Julian walked into the room, his tailored charcoal suit completely unwrinkled, despite the relentless sleepless hours we had put in. He carried a single slim silver tablet in his right hand. "We have successfully intercepted the internal corporate communications regarding their upcoming event," Julian announced, sliding the silver tablet across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of my hands. "Darius and Terrence are hosting a massive, highly publicized networking event tomorrow night called the Vanguard Gala. They have invited the city's elite to watch them parade around in rented velvet tuxedos." I looked down at the glowing digital screen. The display showed a detailed breakdown of the gala's itinerary, the exorbitant catering budget, and the heavily curated guest list. It was a pathetic, transparent display of fake wealth paid for with stolen money and forged signatures. Why throw a massive, expensive party when you are days away from a federal indictment? I asked, my eyes scanning the ridiculous floral budgets Chloe had recklessly approved. It makes absolutely no logical sense. They are drowning in illicit debt. Julian smiled, a sharp, terrifying expression that perfectly mirrored my own rising anticipation. "Because it is a hunting expedition, Ms. Vance. They are completely out of options. They cannot secure traditional bank loans anymore because their credit is ruined, and they have already maxed out the fraudulent lines of credit under your name. The Vanguard Gala is a desperate Hail Mary to attract a private venture capital firm. They need a $5 million cash injection immediately to cover their fraudulent tracks before the federal authorities freeze their assets." I tapped the glass screen, scrolling past the guest list to a digital copy of the pitch deck Darius had submitted. It was filled with meaningless buzzwords, fake algorithms, and outright lies about market share. "And who is the target?" I asked, studying the fraudulent document. "Which venture capital firm is foolish enough to entertain this absolute garbage?" Julian tapped a button on the tablet, opening the final page of Darius's desperate submission. They submitted this specific pitch deck to an anonymous investment group that recently established a major presence in the southeastern tech corridor. A firm known for aggressive acquisitions and endlessly deep pockets. They are practically begging this firm for financial salvation. I read the name printed boldly across the top of the digital page, Apex Capital. I stared at the two words. The letters seemed to vibrate on the screen. My mind raced back through the hundreds of complex corporate documents I had meticulously reviewed and signed over the past 2 days. Vance Holdings was not just a commercial real estate empire. My father had diversified his immense portfolio extensively over the decades, creating multiple powerful subsidiaries to manage different investment branches. One handled international real estate, another managed aggressive mutual funds, and a third handled high-risk technology sector investments. The name of that third subsidiary was Apex Capital. The silence in the penthouse boardroom was absolute. I looked at the name on the screen, and then I looked up at Julian. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting patiently for the realization to fully wash over me. A slow, lethal smile spread across my face. The sheer poetic perfection of the universe was almost too beautiful to comprehend. My ex-husband had violently thrown me out of a moving vehicle into a freezing winter storm because I refused to hand over $80,000 to save his fraudulent brother-in-law. He had stolen my identity to take out millions in illicit loans. Now, facing the terrifying reality of federal prison, he was throwing a lavish, desperate gala to beg a faceless billionaire for $5 million to save his pathetic life. And I was that faceless billionaire. Apex Capital. I whispered the words, tasting like absolute victory on my tongue. Apex Capital is a wholly owned subsidiary of Vance Holdings. That is correct. CEO Vance, Julian replied, his voice humming with dark, undeniable satisfaction. Darius and Terrence are completely unaware of the corporate hierarchy. They have spent weeks aggressively courting Apex Capital, believing it is an independent firm run by out-of-state investors. They have formally invited the lead representative of Apex Capital to attend the Vanguard Gala tomorrow night as their exclusive guest of honor. They have reserved a VIP table right at the front of the ballroom. They are expecting a wealthy stranger to walk through those doors and hand them a $5 million lifeline. I stood up from the heavy leather chair and walked over to the towering windows, looking down at the glowing city streets far below. For 31 years, I had been the invisible daughter, the neglected wife, the socially unfit embarrassment that they constantly tried to hide. They had built their entire kingdom of lies on my back, and now they were waiting for a savior to stop it from crashing down. Julian, I said, not turning away from the glass. Contact Darius's office immediately. Inform them that the CEO of Apex Capital has reviewed their pitch deck and is highly intrigued by their proposal. Julian's pen scratched against his notepad. And what should I tell them regarding your attendance at the gala? Tell them the CEO will be attending in person, I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous icy register. Tell them to prepare for an absolute spectacle. They wanted black excellence. I am going to give them an execution. The following morning, the executive suite of Vance Holdings hummed with predatory efficiency. I did not want to simply crush Darius and Terrence by denying them the money. Denying the funding would send them into bankruptcy, and the federal government would eventually step in to seize their assets. I did not want the government to take everything they owned. I wanted to take it myself. I wanted them to willingly hand me the deeds to their fraudulent lives. Julian sat across from me, a fresh stack of legal documents resting on the mahogany table. I want them to believe they have won. I instructed, my eyes locked on the paperwork. I want them to feel the absolute rush of salvation. Call Darius right now. Tell him Apex Capital is thrilled with their pitch deck. Tell him the board is expediting a preliminary approval for the full $5 million. Julian picked up his phone, dialed the number for Darius's tech startup, and placed the call on speaker. The line rang twice before Darius answered, his voice breathless and frantic, attempting to sound like a busy, in-demand CEO. Darius Washington speaking, he answered, background noise deliberately manufactured to sound like a bustling office environment. Mr. Washington, this is Julian Vance representing the acquisitions board at Apex Capital. Julian's voice was smooth, exuding the casual, untouchable wealth of a venture capital titan. My partners and I reviewed your pitch deck late last night. We are highly impressed with the vision you have outlined for your software platform. The board has authorized me to draft a preliminary approval for your requested $5 million seed investment. A sharp, sudden intake of breath echoed through the speaker. I could picture Darius standing in his heavily mortgaged kitchen, his eyes widening in sheer disbelief as the weight of impending federal prison temporarily lifted off his shoulders. That is exceptional news, Mr. Vance. Darius managed to choke out his voice, trembling despite his best efforts to maintain a professional facade. We are incredibly eager to welcome Apex Capital into our corporate family. We are fully prepared to finalize the partnership at the Vanguard Gala tomorrow evening. Excellent, Julian replied smoothly. However, given the expedited nature of this $5 million cash injection, our legal department requires preliminary documents signed by all principal partners and guarantors prior to the gala. We will have a courier deliver the contracts to your residence within the hour. Review them, sign them, and bring them to the event. Darius agreed instantly, promising the documents would be executed perfectly. Julian ended the call, leaving a profound, heavy silence in the boardroom. He looked at me, sliding a specific single-page document out from the stack. The bait is taken, Julian said. Now for the trap. I picked up the document. It was a masterpiece of legal warfare. It was the poison pill clause. Normally, standard venture capital investments involved corporate liability. If the business failed, the investors lost their money, but the founder's personal assets remained relatively protected. I was not offering a standard investment. I instructed Julian to draft a personal asset forfeiture agreement buried deep within the complex clauses of the preliminary contract. The terms were ironclad and lethal. The clause explicitly stated that if Apex Capital discovered any prior financial fraud, any fabricated revenue metrics, or any forged documentation connected to the startup or its founders, the corporate veil would be instantly pierced. Apex Capital would be granted the immediate, uncontested right to seize all personal assets of every single signatory on the contract. This was not just about Darius and Terrence. To secure a loan of this magnitude, Julian had specifically drafted the paperwork to require additional financial guarantors. Chloe as the co-founder's wife, and Beatrice, whose fraudulent social standing was tied to their accounts, were required to sign. If they put their names on these pages, they were legally offering up their homes, their vehicles, their designer wardrobes, and every stolen penny they possessed as collateral to me. They will never sign this if they actually read it, Julian cautioned, tracing a finger over the devastating forfeiture clause. Any first-year law student would tell them this contract is a financial suicide pact. It gives us the right to liquidate their entire lives the moment we prove the pitch deck is fake. I smiled a lethal smile, setting the document down. They will not read it, Julian. You do not understand the blinding power of their greed. They are cornered animals desperate for survival. They think they are invincible. They believe their own fake narrative of black excellence so completely that they assume Apex Capital is just another stepping stone to their rightful greatness. Send the courier. Across the city, inside the sprawling Buckhead mansion, the atmosphere had shifted from suffocating panic to manic, unhinged euphoria. A high-end courier stepped out of a black town car and handed a thick, wax-sealed envelope to Darius. Darius sprinted back into the formal living room, waving the heavy envelope like a winning lottery ticket. Terrence, Chloe, and Beatrice were gathered around the coffee table, a bottle of vintage champagne already chilling in a silver ice bucket. "We got it!" Darius shouted, tearing the envelope open and pulling out the thick stack of contract papers. Apex Capital is in for the full $5 million. We just need to sign these preliminary agreements, bring them to the gala, and the money is ours. We are saved. Terrence let out a loud, triumphant cheer, high-fiving his brother-in-law. I told you we could pull this off. I told you they would buy the pitch. We are about to be untouchable. Chloe clapped her hands together, her eyes gleaming with greed as she looked at her husband. $5 million, Darius. We can finally upgrade to the estate in Alpharetta. We can pay off the private school tuition for next year. We are going to be the most powerful couple at the country club. Beatrice stood up, smoothing the front of her designer dress, a smug, arrogant expression, settling permanently onto her features. This is exactly what I always envisioned for this family. True, undeniable success. Hand me the pen, Darius. Darius flipped rapidly through the thick stack of complex legal documents. He did not read the terms. He did not look at the asset forfeiture clauses. He did not question why an anonymous venture capital firm required his mother-in-law to sign as a financial guarantor. He was completely blinded by the desperate need to cover up his impending federal crimes. His mind was entirely focused on the $5 million that would keep him out of a prison cell. He signed his name on the designated line with a flourish. He handed the pen to Terrence, who eagerly scrawled his signature, legally binding himself to the poison pill. Chloe grabbed the pen, next signing away her rights to the luxury vehicles and designer bags she paraded online. Finally, Beatrice took the pen. She did not even glance at the text above the signature line. She simply signed, securing her own financial destruction to maintain a fake image of wealth. Darius gathered the signed documents, tapping them against the glass coffee table, completely oblivious to the fact that he was holding his own signed death warrant. "Pop the champagne," Terrence demanded, leaning back against the plush sofa with a look of absolute victory. "We did it. We beat the system. We secured the bag." Darius popped the cork, the expensive liquor bubbling over the rim as he poured 4 glasses. He handed them around the room, raising his own glass high into the air. To Vanguard, Darius toasted, a wicked, triumphant grin on his face. To Apex Capital, our new best friends. Beatrice took a long sip of her champagne, her eyes narrowing as a cruel thought crossed her mind. She looked at Terrence, swirling the bubbles in her crystal flute. It is truly a shame Zuri is not here to see this. Can you imagine the look on her miserable little face if she knew we just secured $5 million without her pathetic $80,000? Terrence scoffed, taking a drink. She is probably sitting in some cheap motel right now, crying over her sick kid and wondering how she is going to pay the lawyer fees I just dumped on her. I told her she was dead weight. I told her she was socially unfit for our world. We cut the cancer out and look what happened. Chloe laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed in the luxurious living room. She is completely irrelevant now. By tomorrow night we will be walking the red carpet, sealing our legacy. Zuri is history. They clinked their crystal glasses together. They drank the expensive champagne, toasting to their own brilliance, mocking my absence and celebrating their ultimate victory. They truly felt like royalty. They believed they had completely outsmarted the banks, outsmarted the federal investigators, and finally won. The following evening, the Vanguard Gala descended upon downtown Atlanta like a glittering, excessively expensive illusion meant to deceive the entire world. The grand ballroom of the historic Biltmore estate had been completely transformed into a temple of unearned excess, paid for entirely by the desperate impending fraud of Darius and Terence. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded from the vaulted ceiling, suspended meticulously above massive crystal chandeliers that refracted blinding light across the room. Waiters in pristine tailored white jackets circulated silently through the crowd, balancing heavy silver trays piled high with beluga caviar, truffle canapes, and endlessly flowing vintage champagne. At the exact center of the room, a massive custom-carved ice sculpture of the Vanguard logo slowly melted under the warm amber lighting, a perfect fleeting metaphor for their vanishing empire. The guest list was a meticulously curated who is who of Atlanta high society. Local politicians glad-handed with real estate tycoons and minor celebrities, all eager to attach their names to the next big tech unicorn. Pastor Ezekiel and the elite upper crust of the First Emmanuel Church congregation mingled near the premium open bar, eagerly soaking in the atmosphere, desperate to be seen in the presence of such overwhelming, undeniable affluence. At the absolute epicenter of this manufactured universe stood my family, aggressively basking in the artificial glow of their impending salvation. Beatrice was holding court near a towering floral arrangement, draped heavily in a midnight blue silk gown. She absolutely could not afford her wrists heavy with tennis bracelets purchased through illicit credit lines. She was completely in her element, surrounded by a tight circle of envious church gossips and eager social climbers. She laughed loudly, tilting her head back dramatically to ensure her rented diamonds caught the light of the chandeliers. "My sons-in-law are absolute visionaries," Beatrice bragged, her voice deliberately raised to carry over the smooth jazz playing from the live band in the corner. "Darius is about to secure a multi-million-dollar partnership tonight with one of the largest, most exclusive venture capital firms in the entire country. And Terence is right by his side handling the complex legal framework. It takes a certain rare breed of men to build true generational wealth. You simply cannot teach that level of excellence. You are either born to rule or you are born to serve." A few feet away, Chloe was playing the role of the perfect supportive tech wife to the hilt. She wore a backless silver couture gown that left little to the imagination, her smartphone permanently raised as she documented every single second for her thousands of social media followers. She posed constantly with local influencers, pouting her lips and flashing her rented jewelry, endlessly promoting the narrative of their untouchable success. #Vanguard Gala. She murmured into her phone camera, panning the lens across the crowded, opulent ballroom. #blessed, #building empires, #protecting our peace. Terence, meanwhile, stood near the velvet ropes of the VIP lounge holding a heavy crystal tumbler of top-shelf scotch. He was surrounded by a group of young, ambitious, wide-eyed men from the church who hung onto his every word, desperate to learn the fabricated secrets of his supposed financial mastery. Terence adjusted the cuffs of his tailored velvet tuxedo, exuding the smug, toxic arrogance of a man who firmly believed he had outsmarted the universe and won the ultimate prize. "You have to be utterly ruthless if you want to win in this economy," Terence lectured, swirling the amber liquid in his glass with a practiced air of superiority. "You cannot let personal attachments or emotional baggage drag you down. If someone is not aligning with your ultimate vision, you cut them loose without a second thought. I had to make a hard leadership decision this week, gentlemen. I dropped my deadweight ex-wife. She completely lacked vision. She wanted to settle for mediocrity, crying over medical bills and playing the eternal victim. I do not have the time or the patience for that kind of negative energy. A man has to protect his peace and focus exclusively on building his empire. You surround yourself with winners or you sink to the bottom with the losers." Darius paced near the front entrance of the VIP section, constantly checking the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist. He was sweating slightly under the stiff collar of his suit, the impending doom of his fraudulent loans, battling violently with the absolute certainty that his salvation was about to walk through those doors. He pulled Terence aside, gripping his arm tightly, his eyes wide and manic. "The corporate liaison said the CEO of Apex Capital is arriving at exactly 8 o'clock, Darius whispered, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy double doors of the ballroom. "We need to be standing right there to intercept them the second they walk in. We get them a drink, we walk them directly to the VIP table, and we execute the final contract signature. We are minutes away from $5 million, Terence. Minutes away from being completely clear of the bank." Terence smirked, clapping Darius hard on the shoulder, supreme confidence radiating from his posture. "Relax, man. The bait is taken." They reviewed the pitch deck, and they loved it. "We have the signed preliminary contracts right here in my briefcase. The moment the Apex CEO walks in, we roll out the red carpet, we shake their hand, and we own this city." At precisely 8 o'clock, a subtle electric shift rippled through the grand ballroom. The lead event coordinator, a frantic woman wearing a black headset, scurried past Beatrice and tapped Darius on the shoulder, whispering urgently into his ear. Darius's eyes lit up with predatory, desperate excitement. He snapped his fingers loudly, gesturing wildly for Terence, Chloe, and Beatrice to assemble immediately. "They are here," Darius hissed, straightening his tie and puffing out his chest to project maximum authority. "The Apex Capital executive team just pulled up to the private valet. Everyone get into position right now. Smile Project Immense Wealth, and do not say a single word until I formally introduce us." Beatrice smoothed the front of her gown, a look of extreme, greedy anticipation washing over her carefully contoured face. Chloe quickly checked her reflection in her phone screen, making absolutely sure her rented diamonds were perfectly aligned for the cameras. Terence stood tall, puffing out his chest, putting on his best, most intimidating legal shark persona. They formed a unified, impenetrable wall of fake excellence, staring hungrily at the heavy double doors of the ballroom, waiting eagerly for their anonymous billionaire savior to arrive and validate their entire fraudulent existence. The live jazz band abruptly stopped playing mid-note, the sudden absence of music acting like a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. A heavy hush began to fall over the front of the room, spreading rapidly outward like a ripple across a pond as guests turned their attention toward the sudden commotion at the main entrance. The massive 12-foot oak doors of the Biltmore Ballroom did not just open. They were pushed forcefully wide open by two broad-shouldered private security guards wearing dark suits and discreet earpieces. The low murmur of the wealthy crowd died completely. The silence was sudden, absolute, and heavy with the electric tension of immense concentrated power entering the room. People naturally began to step backward, parting like the Red Sea to create a wide, clear path from the entrance all the way to the velvet ropes of the VIP section where my family stood waiting. I stepped across the threshold. I did not look like the exhausted, financially ruined, frightened woman Terence had abandoned in the freezing rain on the side of a highway. I did not look like the submissive, forgotten daughter Beatrice had belittled and controlled for 31 years. I had undergone a complete molecular transformation. I wore a custom-tailored, emerald green silk gown that moved like liquid glass, wrapping around my frame with unforgiving, lethal elegance. The color was deep rich and radiated genuine generational old money power. There were no rented diamonds around my neck. I wore a single flawless heirloom emerald pendant that belonged to the David Vance estate, a piece of jewelry worth more than the entire Biltmore venue combined. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, razor-sharp style, and my makeup was flawless, highlighting the cold, calculating CEO I was always meant to be. I did not walk into the room. I commanded it. My posture was perfectly straight, my steps measured, deliberate and lethal. Flanking my right side was Julian, dressed in a bespoke midnight blue suit, holding the black leather briefcase that contained their signed death warrants. Behind us marched a formidable, unsmiling phalanx of 6 high-powered corporate litigators from Vance Holdings, all carrying briefcases moving in perfect, intimidating synchronization. The visual impact of my arrival was devastating. The crowd of elite socialites, politicians, and church gossips stared in absolute breathless shock. They recognized me, but their brains could not reconcile the discarded, socially unfit woman they knew with the untouchable titan currently walking across the marble floor. Pastor Ezekiel's jaw dropped, his eyes bulging as I glided past him. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead, completely ignoring the gasps and the frantic, panicked whispering that slowly began to erupt around me. I walked straight down the center of the ballroom, the sea of people parting instantly to let my private security detail through. At the end of the parted crowd, standing in front of their lavish, roped-off VIP table, my family froze in absolute terror. The smug, victorious smiles literally melted off their faces like hot wax. Darius's jaw went completely slack, his eyes bulging out of his head as he tried desperately to process the impossible sight before him. Chloe dropped her phone, the expensive device clattering loudly against the polished marble floor, the screen cracking instantly, completely forgotten. Beatrice took a staggering, unsteady step backward, her hand flying to her throat as if she had just seen a ghost, her face turning an ashen, sickly shade of gray. Terrence looked like he had been physically struck by a freight train. His crystal tumbler of top-shelf scotch slipped from his numb fingers, shattering into dozens of sharp pieces, the expensive amber liquid soaking into the hem of his velvet trousers. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound, mind-breaking confusion and rising instinctual terror. He expected me to be shivering in a cheap motel room crushed by his divorce papers and credit card debt. He did not expect me to walk into his exclusive gala flanked by a private army of corporate lawyers. Zuri Terrence choked out his voice, barely a raspy, pathetic whisper that carried loudly in the dead silence of the ballroom. What are you doing here? You are not allowed to be here. Security. Get security. She is crashing the event. I did not stop walking until I was standing exactly 3 feet away from him. The height of my heels put me directly at his eye level. I looked at Terrence, my gaze stripping away every single ounce of his manufactured pride. I did not look at him with anger or sadness. I looked at him like he was a minor accounting error waiting to be permanently corrected. Julian stepped forward, smoothly bypassing Terrence entirely, and locked his eyes on a hyperventilating Darius. "Mr. Washington," Julian said, his voice ringing out clearly across the silent, captivated ballroom. "I am Julian Vance, lead counsel for Apex Capital. I believe we have an appointment to finalize your $5 million investment." Darius looked at Julian, then looked at me, his brain violently short-circuiting as the catastrophic reality began to tear through his skull. He looked at the emerald pendant around my neck. He looked at the army of lawyers standing behind me. He looked at the chilling, lethal smile spreading across my face. I took one step closer to the men who had stolen my name, forged my signature, and tried to leave my son to die. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through the silence like a diamond-tipped blade. "I hear you are desperately looking for a wealthy investor to save your lives." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Ice slowly melted in abandoned glasses. Terrence stared at me, his mouth open like a man who had stepped off a cliff waiting for gravity to notice him. Beatrice was immobilized. The gold bracelets clattered against her sides as her hands trembled. Chloe stared at the cracked screen of her dropped phone, too terrified to retrieve it. Darius was the first to break the paralysis. His survival instinct, honed by years of running cons, kicked in. His face twisted into a mask of panic. He lunged toward the velvet rope, waving his arms wildly at the private security guards stationed near the entrance. "Remove her," Darius shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "She is an unauthorized guest. She is trespassing. Get her out of this building immediately before I have you all fired." The security guards took a single uncertain step forward, but Julian moved faster. He stepped smoothly into Darius's path, a solid wall of bespoke tailoring and corporate authority. Julian reached inside his pocket and produced a matte black identification card embossed with the silver Apex Capital insignia. He held it up directly in front of Darius's eyes. "I advise against calling security." "Mr. Washington," Julian stated, his voice ringing with chilling calm. "As the legal representatives of Apex Capital, we are the primary financial sponsors of this event. Apex Capital technically owns the lease on this ballroom for the evening. If anyone is going to be escorted off the premises tonight, it will be you. Now, I suggest you step back and listen carefully to what my employer has to say." Darius stared at the identification card. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified shell. He stumbled backward, bumping heavily into Terrence, who had not moved an inch. I turned my back on them. They were no longer worth my attention. I walked past their VIP table, ignoring the half-empty bottles of champagne they had just popped to celebrate my demise. I approached the stairs leading up to the main stage. The jazz band had abandoned their instruments, shrinking back into the shadows of the velvet curtains. I walked to the center of the stage and gripped the chrome stem of the microphone stand. I looked out over the sea of faces. Hundreds of Atlanta's elite socialites, local politicians, and wealthy church officials stared back at me in breathless anticipation. I saw Pastor Ezekiel sweating profusely in the second row, clutching his heavy leather-bound prayer book. I saw the wealthy real estate developers who had been eagerly waiting to hand Darius their money, looking around in severe confusion. "Good evening, everyone," I began. My voice did not shake. I did not scream. I spoke with a smooth, professional, and deadly cadence that commanded absolute obedience from every person in the room. The sound system amplified my words, sending them echoing off the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers. "Many of you were invited here tonight under the assumption that you were attending a celebration of Black excellence." I continued, my eyes scanning the massive room. "You were told you would be witnessing the birth of a revolutionary technology platform. You were promised a glimpse into the future of generational wealth spearheaded by Darius Washington and Terrence Vance." I paused, letting the names hang heavily in the tense air. I looked directly down at the VIP section. Terrence flinched violently, as if I had physically struck him across the face. "Allow me to formally reintroduce myself," I said, my voice dropping to a dark, resonant register. "My name is Zuri Vance. I am not the socially unfit ex-wife Terrence has been boasting about all evening. I am the sole heir to the David Vance estate. I am the chief executive officer of Vance Holdings. And as of 48 hours ago, I am the absolute head of Apex Capital." The collective gasp that ripped through the ballroom was deafening. It was a physical shockwave of sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Women covered their mouths in horror. Wealthy investors began frantically whispering to their business partners. Pastor Ezekiel dropped his prayer book, the heavy thud echoing sharply in the front row. The magnitude of the elaborate deception they had nearly fallen for was rapidly washing over the stunned crowd. In the VIP section, the destruction of my family's fake empire was visibly manifesting. Beatrice shrank. Her arrogant posture collapsed inward, her shoulders hunching as she tried to hide behind a floral arrangement. She was no longer a high society matriarch holding court. She was a pathetic fraud exposed. Chloe covered her face with her shaking hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Her rented diamonds looked like cheap plastic against her skin. She knew her social standing was permanently eradicated. Terrence was shaking his head from side to side in rapid movements, desperately trying to deny reality. He looked at me on the stage, his mind violently rejecting the fact that the woman he had mentally and financially abused for years was now holding his absolute destruction in her hands. "For the past 2 years, Darius and Terrence have sold you a masterfully constructed lie," I announced, projecting my voice to the back of the room. "They have paraded around this city in tailored suits, maliciously soliciting your investments and promising you impossible financial returns. They threw this lavish gala tonight with one specific goal. They intended to secure a $5 million seed investment from Apex Capital to cover up a staggering trail of federal crimes." I turned my head and gave Julian a sharp nod. Julian tapped a command into his silver tablet. The digital projector screen suspended behind me blinked to life. It did not display the logo of Darius's fake technology startup. Instead, it illuminated the room with undeniable high-resolution proof of their criminality. The first slide displayed a side-by-side comparison of banking documents. On the left was the falsified revenue report Darius had submitted to local investors. On the right were the actual intercepted bank statements Julian's team had legally extracted. The numbers were damning. The startup had exactly 0 active users and 0 legitimate revenue streams. It was a complete fabricated mirage. The crowd began to murmur angrily. Investors who had already handed Darius money were pulling out their cell phones, frantically dialing their personal attorneys. Julian tapped the tablet again. The screen shifted to display the fraudulent loan applications. The high-risk corporate loans totaling over $2 million were blown up to massive proportions for everyone to see. I stepped to the side, pointing directly at the guarantor's signature lines highlighted in bright crimson red. "Those are my forged signatures," I stated clearly, letting the heavy weight of the federal crime settle over the room. When their trust funds dried up, Darius and Terrence stole my identity. They used my pristine credit score to fraudulently secure millions of dollars in loans to fund their fake lifestyle. They bought the luxury cars, designer clothes, and expensive country club memberships using stolen debt in my name. They needed $5 million from Apex Capital tonight to prevent the national banks from triggering a federal wire fraud investigation. I looked down at Terrence. His eyes were wide with pure terror. He was sweating profusely, the expensive fabric of his velvet tuxedo shirt clinging wetly to his chest. Julian tapped the tablet one final time. The screen abruptly changed to display the preliminary approval contract that Darius, Terrence, Chloe, and Beatrice had eagerly signed just hours ago in their kitchen. The document was magnified, focusing specifically on the lethal poison pill clause buried deep within the legal text. "You are so desperate to save yourselves, so blinded by your own toxic arrogance, that you never actually read the contract you signed today," I said, my voice echoing with ruthless finality. "You believed you had outsmarted everyone, but you just signed a personal asset forfeiture agreement directly with Apex Capital. The clause explicitly states that in the event of discovered financial fraud, the corporate veil is instantly pierced." I stepped to the edge of the stage, looking down at the four of them cowering behind the velvet ropes. "Apex Capital is denying your $5 million investment request," I announced, delivering the final lethal blow. "Furthermore, executing the strict terms of the contract you willingly signed this afternoon, Apex Capital is seizing every asset you possess to recover the stolen funds. Effective immediately. I own your bank accounts. I own your luxury vehicles. I own your jewelry. I own your mortgaged home in Buckhead. If you purchased a single cup of coffee with my stolen money, I now own the cup. You are completely bankrupt." The silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the pathetic sound of Chloe's hysterical crying. Beatrice slumped heavily against the VIP table, clutching her chest as she gasped for air, her entire fake reality completely obliterated. Darius stared blankly at the massive screen, his mind completely broken by the sheer magnitude of his public defeat. But it was Terrence who provided the final collapse. The realization that he had just willingly handed me the legal authority to destroy him was too much for his brain to process. He looked at me, the woman he tried to break, and realized he was going straight to federal prison. His legs gave out beneath him. Terrence's knees buckled violently, and he collapsed onto the polished marble floor, landing hard amid the shattered remains of his scotch glass. Terrence hit the polished marble floor with a sickening thud, his body crumpling amid the shattered remains of his crystal scotch glass. The expensive amber liquid pooled around his trembling fingers, staining the pristine white cuffs of his tailored velvet tuxedo. He lay there gasping for air like a landed fish, his eyes wide and vacant as the crushing reality of his total bankruptcy finally severed his connection to reality. The man who had spent years systematically destroying my self-worth was now a pathetic, broken heap at my feet. The sight of Terrence collapsing acted as the final violent catalyst for the absolute destruction of Chloe's manufactured reality. She stared down at her ruined husband, and then her panicked gaze darted over to Darius. Her brother was completely frozen, standing rigidly by the velvet ropes, staring blankly up at the massive projector screen that broadcasted his federal crimes to the entire city. The high-pitched wail that suddenly erupted from Chloe's throat did not sound human. It was a guttural, terrifying screech of pure, unfiltered panic that echoed sharply off the vaulted ceilings of the Biltmore ballroom. She fell hard to her knees beside Terrence, not to comfort him, but frantically grabbing at the hem of her rented designer gown, as if the silver fabric itself was suddenly burning her skin. She realized with violent clarity that the sprawling estate in Alpharetta was gone. The private school tuition was gone. Her meticulously curated social media empire was entirely erased. Her husband was not a tech visionary building generational wealth. He was a desperate fraud who had just dragged her into a massive federal conspiracy. She began tearing at her own hair, sobbing so violently, her chest heaved, smearing her expensive makeup across her face in ugly dark streaks. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung open for a second time. Julian had not left anything to chance. He had coordinated this execution with microscopic precision, ensuring the trap snapped shut with inescapable force. A dozen uniformed Atlanta police officers, flanked closely by two plainclothes federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division, marched into the venue in a tight, impenetrable formation. The heavy tread of their boots echoed like a death knell against the marble floor, cutting through the sound of Chloe's hysterical sobbing. The remaining guests scrambled desperately out of their way, pressing their backs against the walls and knocking over floral arrangements to avoid being associated with the impending arrests. The officers bypassed the bewildered crowd and marched directly toward the VIP section. Darius did not even attempt to run. As two officers grabbed him by the shoulders and forcefully hauled him to his feet, he went completely limp. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed through the silent room. Darius hung his head, a broken man entirely defeated by his own boundless arrogance. Another pair of officers grabbed Terrence by the arms, hauling him up from the puddle of spilled scotch. Terrence began to hyperventilate, his eyes rolling back in his head as the cold steel locked around his wrists. Chloe screamed again, slapping her hands tightly over her ears as her husband and brother were dragged away through the parted crowd of horrified socialites. The sight of her golden sons-in-law being hauled away in handcuffs finally broke Beatrice from her paralyzed stupor. The matriarch of the family, the woman who had terrorized and belittled me for 3 decades, suddenly realized she was entirely out of options. The safety net of her fake wealth had just evaporated. She looked at the police officers escorting Terrence out the doors. She looked at the whispering, judgmental faces of her elite church peers, who were already stepping away from her. And then she looked up at me standing elevated on the stage, radiating absolute, untouchable power. Desperation rapidly overrode her manufactured dignity. Beatrice shoved past a stunned Pastor Ezekiel, practically sprinting toward the stage in a blind panic. She tripped over the hem of her heavy midnight blue silk gown, stumbling awkwardly, but managed to catch herself on the edge of the raised platform. She looked up at me, her carefully contoured makeup streaked with tears of pure terror. She reached out with shaking hands, gripping the chrome base of my microphone stand with white knuckles. She was attempting to weaponize the very title she had spent my entire life disgracing. "Zuri," Beatrice cried out, her voice cracking loudly, projecting a sickeningly sweet, entirely fabricated tone of maternal desperation intended for the audience. "Zuri, please listen to me. You have made your point perfectly clear. You have proven to everyone that you are powerful and successful. But you must stop this right now before it goes any further. We are blood. We are family. I am your mother. You cannot do this to us in front of the entire congregation. Please, daughter, I am begging you to keep family business private. Have mercy on us." The sheer audacity of her plea was staggering. She was invoking the sacred title of mother, attempting to leverage a relationship she had maliciously destroyed. She was begging for mercy in front of the exact same peers she had consistently used to humiliate me at every social gathering. I looked down at Beatrice kneeling at the edge of the stage. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt pure ice in my veins, freezing out the last remaining fraction of the frightened little girl who used to beg for this woman's approval. I pulled the microphone off the stand, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the edge of the stage, looming over her trembling form. "Family business," I echoed into the microphone, my voice projecting a cold, unwavering authority across the silent ballroom. "You ceased being my family the moment you helped Terrence throw me out of a moving vehicle while I was clutching a dying baby. You ceased being my mother the moment you watched my son turn blue from oxygen deprivation and told me to figure it out myself because you had a gala to attend." I raised my left hand, signaling Julian for the final strike. The digital projector screen behind me flashed brightly, instantly replacing the fraudulent corporate contracts with a new, highly detailed set of legal documents. The massive image was split directly down the middle. On the left side was a stark, high-resolution scan of my father's original, unaltered will from 10 years ago. On the right side were massive, highlighted bank statements showing monthly direct transfers from an offshore trust account directly into Beatrice's personal checking accounts. I turned my attention back to the captivated crowd, my voice echoing with devastating clarity. 10 years ago, my father passed away. He left behind a massive corporate estate, but he also left behind a specific secondary trust explicitly designed to fund my education, my housing, and my medical needs. That trust was meant to protect me and ensure my future, but I never saw a single penny of it. For 10 years, I believed my father had left me absolutely nothing. I believed I was entirely reliant on Terrence's charity to survive. I looked down at Beatrice. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound she appeared physically ill. She stared at the glowing screen above me, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. She knew exactly what I had uncovered. Julian's microscopic forensic audit did not just expose Darius and Terrence's current tech fraud. It dug up the original rot at the very foundation of this family. It exposed the genesis of their fake wealth. "You and Terrence conspired together a decade ago," I stated, my words cutting through the room like a surgical scalpel. "You maliciously forged the secondary trust documents. You legally assigned yourself as the primary executor of my inheritance by faking my signature on the beneficiary release forms. For 10 years, you systematically drained millions of dollars that rightfully belonged to me. You used my father's money to buy this ridiculous designer wardrobe you are wearing tonight. You used my money to fund your elite church donations, buying your status as a respected elder in the community. You used my stolen inheritance to finance Darius's fake company and fund Chloe's luxury lifestyle." I leaned down, bringing my face mere inches from hers. The microphone caught every single sharp, lethal syllable as I delivered the final verdict. "You sold out your grandson's heartbeat for a designer dress mother." The absolute silence in the ballroom shattered instantly. The crowd erupted into a chaotic frenzy of gasps, horrified whispers, and outright shouts of disgust. Pastor Ezekiel covered his face with his hands, physically stepping backward to distance himself entirely from the toxic fallout. The wealthy socialites, who had just minutes ago been hanging on to Beatrice's every arrogant word, were now looking at her with pure, unadulterated revulsion. The grand illusion she had spent decades meticulously building was completely annihilated in front of her most coveted audience. Beatrice shook her head violently, letting go of the microphone stand and taking a trembling, unsteady step backward. "No," she whimpered, her voice barely audible over the roaring judgment of the crowd. "No, Zuri, you do not understand the pressure I was under. I had to maintain the legacy. I had to protect our status in this city. I did it for the family name." "Your status is a felony," I replied, straightening my posture and looking past her toward the back of the room. "And Apex Capital is not the only entity interested in your extensive financial history. The police are waiting for you too. Forgery and grand larceny." As I spoke those words, 2 female police officers stepped forward from the shadows at the back of the room, cutting quickly through the horrified crowd. They approached Beatrice, gripping her arms firmly and spinning her around. Beatrice did not fight them. She did not scream or attempt to run. The sheer, overwhelming shock of the public execution had drained every single ounce of fight from her body. She hung her head in absolute crushing shame. Her rented diamonds sparkled pathetically under the crystal chandeliers as the heavy steel handcuffs locked tightly around her wrists, sealing her fate. The officers marched her down the center aisle of the ballroom, parading the disgraced matriarch past her entire congregation, past her wealthy friends, and past the shattered remnants of her favorite son-in-law. The ultimate facade of the perfect church family was permanently shattered into 1,000,000 pieces, swept away into the garbage bin of history. I stood victorious on the stage, the undisputed owner of my empire, watching the last of the poison being dragged out the door. The fallout from the Vanguard Gala was swift, brutal, and entirely public. Local media devoured the scandal, splashing the faces of Atlanta's former golden family across every major news network. Terrence and Darius did not even make it to trial. Faced with undeniable digital evidence and the ironclad asset forfeiture agreement they blindly signed, their defense attorneys advised them to accept a plea deal. They were sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The sprawling tech empire Darius pretended to command dissolved overnight. Terrence, the man who demanded my absolute submission, was completely powerless, stripped of his law license, and locked away. Chloe's descent was equally poetic. The asset forfeiture clause authorized Apex Capital to seize everything she owned. The bank foreclosed on the Alpharetta estate. Tow trucks arrived in the night to repossess her luxury vehicles. Her meticulously curated social media accounts went permanently dark after followers flooded the comments with merciless mockery. Stripped of her rented diamonds and designer wardrobe, Chloe was forced to face reality. She currently works 40 hours a week at a minimum-wage retail clothing store, organizing the exact clearance racks she used to mock. Every paycheck she earns is immediately garnished to repay the millions they stole. Beatrice suffered the absolute worst fate of all. The revelation of her financial betrayal, combined with the spectacular public humiliation at the Biltmore, resulted in her permanent excommunication from First Emmanuel Church. Pastor Ezekiel publicly denounced her actions, banning her from the congregation she worshipped more than God himself. High society slammed its doors in her face. Her country club memberships were revoked. Her so-called friends blocked her number. She now lives in a sparsely furnished studio apartment, spending her days meeting with public defenders as she faces years of grueling legal battles. The perfect church family was nothing but a cautionary tale. 6 months later, the oppressive darkness of my past felt like a lifetime away. I stood inside the sprawling glass-enclosed office of Vance Holdings. The morning sun poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, filling the pristine space with a warm golden light. The heavy mahogany furniture had been replaced with sleek modern designs that reflected a new era of transparent, forward-thinking leadership. A sudden joyful squeal echoed through the quiet room. I turned away from the panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline and smiled. Leo was sitting in the center of a thick cream-colored rug, surrounded by brightly colored wooden building blocks. He clapped his hands together, letting out a musical laugh as he successfully knocked over a tall tower. The sickly, fragile baby who fought for every single breath in the pediatric intensive care unit was completely gone. In his place was a robust, energetic, and perfectly healthy little boy, with bright eyes and a fierce spirit. His recovery had been nothing short of miraculous, fueled by the best specialists money could buy and the absolute devotion of a mother who refused to lose him. Julian stood respectfully near the doorway, holding a sleek silver tablet, his signature sharp suit perfectly tailored. He watched Leo play with a rare, genuine smile, softening his usually intimidating features. Julian had transitioned from my father's trusted counsel to my most valued advisor, and more importantly, a fiercely loyal friend. He had stood by my side through the darkest storms, guiding my hand as I dismantled the empire of lies and built my own legitimate kingdom in its place. "We have a packed schedule today," CEO Vance, Julian announced, stepping forward and handing me a thick leather portfolio. "The board of directors is ready to review the quarterly projections, and the final permits for the new commercial development project have been approved by the city council." I took the portfolio, running my hand over the embossed leather. "Let the board wait a few minutes. Julian, I want to review the final charter for the foundation first." Julian nodded, tapping his tablet to bring up the documents. "The David Vance Memorial Foundation is fully funded and operational. The initial endowment of $50 million has been successfully secured in the primary trust." I walked over to my desk and looked at the framed photograph of Leo resting next to my computer monitor. Claiming my father's corporate empire was only the first step in my journey. True power was not about hoarding wealth. It was about tearing down the barriers that kept others trapped in the dark. I had used a significant portion of my vast newly acquired wealth to establish a massive charitable foundation operating strictly outside the corporate umbrella of Vance Holdings. The foundation had one singular, uncompromising mission. It was specifically designed to fund emergency medical care, housing, and legal advocacy for children of single marginalized mothers. I hired pediatric specialists, social workers, and financial advisors to seek out women drowning in medical debt, fighting a system designed to crush them. I poured my resources into building free clinics in underserved neighborhoods and establishing emergency grants accessed within hours. I ensured no mother would ever have to stand in the freezing rain, holding a dying child, begging a cruel world for mercy. I took the pain my family had inflicted upon me and forged it into an impenetrable shield for others. I walked back to the window, looking out over the sprawling city that I now firmly controlled. The sky was a brilliant cloudless blue, stretching out endlessly toward the horizon. I picked up Leo, holding his warm, solid weight against my chest, breathing in the sweet, clean scent of his hair. He rested his head on my shoulder, completely safe, completely loved, and absolutely protected. They thought they could leave me to die in the storm, believing I was nothing but a shadow in their perfect picture. But they forgot one thing. When you strip a woman of her fear, you give her absolute power. They threw me to the wolves, not knowing I owned the pack.